Adeline's voice was a low, dangerous hiss. "Do you think this is a joke?" Rhys Bowen straightened up from where he leaned against the grand piano, his hands raised in a placating gesture that did nothing to quell the fire in her eyes. "Ma'am, I was just—" "You were just what?" She cut him off, her fury a tightly coiled snake. She took a step closer, placing herself in front of the small, weeping girl cowering behind the piano bench. "Finding new ways to be cruel? Do you get some kind of sick satisfaction from tormenting a child who can't defend herself? Who can't even scream at you to stop?" She pointed a trembling finger toward the elevators, her expression one of utter disgust. "You are fired. Get out of my sight before I have you arrested." It had all happened in less than 90 seconds. Just 3 minutes earlier, the cavernous 50th floor lounge had been a sanctuary of silence, broken only by a ghost of a melody. 9-year-old Victoria Vance, a girl imprisoned in a fortress of silence for 368 days, sat at the massive piano, her small back rigid. Her pale, delicate fingers tapped out the simple, lonely notes of "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star." It was her only language now, a string of predictable sounds in a world that had become terrifyingly unpredictable. Rhys Bowen had been making his nightly rounds, the rhythmic swish of his mop the only other sound in the vast, empty space. For 6 months, he had been a ghost in a gray polo, paid to go unnoticed. And every evening, he saw the girl. He saw the profound, bottomless sorrow in her eyes. He watched her play, not with the casual disinterest of a janitor, but with the aching, analytical focus of the man he used to be, a man who had once been a leading expert in the very prison that held this child captive. Tonight was different. He felt a shift in the air, a desperate pull from a part of himself he had tried to bury. He put his mop aside and walked toward the piano, his worn boots silent on the marble. He didn't approach Alara directly, but leaned against the far curve of the instrument, his gaze fixed on the glittering city below. He began to hum along with her melody, his voice a low, gentle baritone. Ilara's fingers stopped. She looked up, her eyes wide with caution. He offered a small, tired smile, one that acknowledged their shared quiet. "That's a beautiful song," he said softly. He then looked directly at her, his voice steady, and made the most bizarre and cruel request she could imagine. "You have a lovely touch on the keys. Can you sing it for me?" The question, spoken so gently, was a deliberate, calculated strike at the very heart of her trauma. Ilara's face crumpled, her eyes, wide with shock and humiliation, instantly filled with tears. She shrank back from the piano as if its keys had burned her. A choked, silent sob caught in her throat. And that was the moment her mother had walked in. Now, standing in the aftermath of her verdict, Adeline watched as 2 security guards materialized, flanking Rhys. Her heart hammered with a righteous fury. She had vanquished the monster, protected her child. Rhys didn't struggle. He didn't argue or plead. He simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and allowed them to take his elbows. As they began to lead him away, he looked over Adeline's shoulder at the small, weeping girl huddled behind her. His expression was not one of anger or shame. It was one of profound, soul-crushing pity. But the pity wasn't for himself, or even for the little girl. It was for Adeline. The look burrowed under her skin. Why would he look at her that way? She pushed the thought away, kneeling to wrap her arms around her daughter. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "He's gone. The bad man is gone." Ilara didn't respond. She just sobbed, her small body shaking against her mother's. Adeline held her tightly, the scent of her daughter's lavender shampoo a small comfort in the suddenly oppressive silence of the lounge. The monster was gone. The threat was neutralized. The problem was solved. But as she held her silent, weeping child, and the image of the janitor's pitying gaze burned in her mind, a tiny, cold splinter of doubt began to work its way into her heart. The man's actions were monstrous. There was no question. But his eyes had not looked like the eyes of a monster. They had looked like the eyes of a man who knew a secret she didn't. The silence that Reese's departure left behind was heavier than the one that had preceded it. It was thick with the echoes of Adeline's fury and her daughter's silent sobs. She held Elara for a long time, the polished marble floor cold even through the thin fabric of her trousers. The company's crisis protocol, a system she herself had designed, was already kicking in. Her phone buzzed insistently in her pocket. It would be her head of security, then HR, then legal. A tidy, efficient chain of command to neutralize a problem. She ignored it. Right now, there was only the small, trembling weight in her arms. "Come on, sweetie," she whispered, her voice still shaky. "Let's go home." Elara followed without resistance, a little ghost in a plaid uniform, her face pale and tear-stained. The ride down in the private elevator was silent. The short walk through the pristine underground garage to her black sedan was silent. The journey through the glittering, indifferent city streets was silent. Adeline drove on autopilot, her knuckles white on the leather-wrapped steering wheel. Her anger was a roaring fire, but beneath it, the janitor's pitying gaze was a persistent, unnerving chill. It didn't make sense. A man who gets pleasure from tormenting children should look smug when caught, or afraid, or angry. He should not look like he felt sorry for her. The dissonance was a crack in the perfect solid wall of her rage. She glanced in the rear-view mirror. Elara was staring out the window, her cheek pressed against the cool glass, lost in a world Adeline couldn't enter. To distract from the suffocating silence, Adeline switched on the radio, keeping the volume low. A soft, instrumental piano piece filled the car. It wasn't offensive, anonymous. Background noise. The piece ended, and the next one began. Adeline's hand shot toward the console, her muscles tensing. The melody. That same, simple, haunting melody. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. A string orchestra arrangement, swelling with a syrupy sentimentality that suddenly felt grotesque. She had to turn it off. It was a reminder of the ugly scene, of her daughter's humiliation. But before her fingers could touch the button, she heard it. It was a sound so small, so faint, she thought at first she'd imagined it. A tiny, breathy note, like the hum of a hummingbird's wings. It came from the back seat. Adeline froze, her hand hovering over the console. She held her breath, listening. There it was again. It was tuneless. It was almost inaudible. But it was a sustained, controlled vocal sound, and it was following the melody perfectly. Adeline's heart hammered against her ribs. She stared into the rear-view mirror. Elara was still looking out the window, seemingly lost in the passing city lights. She was humming unconsciously, a quiet, private act, as natural as breathing, the way a child does when a familiar song comes on. A child who had not made a single, voluntary vocal sound in over a year. Adeline swerved the car to the curb, bringing it to an abrupt halt that chirped the tires. She twisted in her seat, her eyes wide. "Elara," she breathed. The humming stopped. Elara turned from the window, her eyes blinking, as if waking from a dream. She looked at her mother with a quiet confusion, unaware of what she had just done. But Adeline knew. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a result. A direct and undeniable consequence of the janitor's cruel, inexplicable request. He hadn't just made her cry. He had somehow shaken a sound loose. He had reached into the fortress of her silence and pulled something out. The rest of the drive home was a blur. Adeline's mind was no longer a furnace of rage, but a whirlwind of confusion. She put Elara to bed, the little girl so exhausted from the emotional ordeal that she fell asleep almost instantly. Adeline was left alone in the vast, silent penthouse. She paced the living room, the city lights spread out before her like a carpet of diamonds. The janitor was no longer just a monster she had vanquished. He was a puzzle. A man who committed an act of cruelty that produced a miracle. She finally stopped pacing and pulled out her phone. She didn't call legal. She didn't call HR. She called the direct line of Arthur Vance, her stoic, unflappable head of security. He answered on the first ring. "Miss Vance, I was about to call you. The incident has been contained. The temp's name is Reese Bowen. The agency has been notified of the termination, the police report," Adeline said, her voice a carefully controlled, even tone. "I want to hold off on filing it for now." There was a slight pause. "Understood, ma'am." "Arthur," she said, walking to the window and staring down at the city 20 floors below. "I want to know who he is, not just his name from the temp agency. I want to know where he worked before. I want to know where he lives. I want to know everything. Are you concerned he might be a threat?" Arthur asked, his professional concern evident. Adeline thought of the pity in Reese Bowen's eyes. She thought of the impossible, miraculous hum that had filled her car just an hour ago. "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm concerned he might be the only person who can tell me what's wrong with my daughter." The next morning, the sun rose over a city that felt fundamentally different. Adeline sat in her sterile home office, a fortress of glass and steel overlooking the metropolis, but she felt exposed, adrift. A dozen urgent reports on her monitor went unread. 100 emails went unanswered. She was waiting. Just before 10 a.m., a discreet chime announced the arrival of a secure file. From Vance. Subject, Bowen, R. She opened it, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The first page was exactly what she expected. A grainy photo of the janitor, looking tired and nondescript. An address in a rundown borough on the other side of the river. A string of temp jobs for the last 4 years. Warehouse stocker, delivery driver, and most recently, janitor. It was a portrait of a man going nowhere. Then she clicked to the second page, and the world tilted. Before the 4-year gap, the man in the photo was almost unrecognizable. He was Dr. Reese Bowen, MS, CCCSLP, a master's degree from Stanford. A decade as a pediatric speech-language pathologist at the city's most prestigious children's hospital. He hadn't just been a therapist. He had been the head of the Department of Childhood Trauma. There were links to published articles, keynote speeches, awards. He was a star, a pioneer in his field. A cold dread mixed with awe washed over her. The man she had fired, the man she had called a monster, was one of the foremost experts in the world on her daughter's exact condition. The file contained one last attachment, a link to a local news article dated 4 years, 2 months, and 6 days ago. The headline was stark: "Tragic house fire, claims lives of doctor and children." Adeline's breath caught in her throat. She clicked. A picture of a smiling, happy family appeared on her screen. There was Reese, younger, his face full of light. Beside him, a beautiful woman, Dr. Elias Bowen, and in front of them, 2 bright-eyed children, a boy named Liam, age 7, and a girl, Chloe, age 5. The article detailed the faulty wiring, the speed of the blaze. The sole survivor, it noted, was the husband and father, Dr. Reese Bowen. Adeline pushed her chair back from the desk as if the screen had physically struck her. It all crashed into place with sickening clarity. The 4-year gap. The flight from his brilliant career, the ghost-like existence, and the pity in his eyes. He hadn't been looking at a CEO and her difficult daughter. He had been looking at a mother who was failing her child with the full, terrible weight of a father who no longer could. Her decision was instant. She grabbed her car keys, ignoring the buzz of her phone summoning her to a meeting she no longer cared about. The drive across the bridge was a journey to another planet. The gleaming skyscrapers gave way to brick tenements and dilapidated storefronts. She parked her gleaming sedan, a black pearl in a sea of rust and grime, in front of a building that looked like it was being held up by sheer force of will. She found his apartment on the 4th floor. The hallway smelled of dust and despair. She knocked. her knuckles rapping against the peeling paint. The door opened. Rhys Bowen stood there. He wasn't surprised to see her. He just looked tired, a man already bearing a weight so heavy that nothing else could possibly add to it. His apartment behind him was obsessively clean, but barren. No photos, no decorations, a room scrubbed clean of memories. "The humming," she said, her voice strained. There was no point in pleasantries. In the car, on the way home, she was humming the song. "Explain it to me." He was silent for a moment, then stepped back. A silent invitation to enter. "The brain is a funny thing, Miss Vance," he said, his voice flat, clinical. "It processes speech primarily in the left hemisphere. Wernicke's area, Broca's area. When a trauma is severe enough, it can erect a wall around that whole system, a complete psychological lockdown." He gestured to a simple wooden chair. She remained standing. "But music, Melody," he continued, his eyes focused on a spot on the far wall. "That lives somewhere else, mostly in the right hemisphere. It's a different pathway, a different door. For some people, people with stutters, aphasia, traumatic mutism, they can sing words they can't speak. The music bypasses the wall." He finally looked at her. "I wasn't asking her to talk. I was checking to see if the musical door was still unlocked. I had to know if the person inside was still there, listening." He gave a slight, humorless shrug. "Her humming told me the key is still in the lock. She just has to be convinced to turn it." The simple, brilliant logic of it, laid bare in the face of his own unimaginable tragedy, was humbling. All her experts, all her money, and she had never heard anything so clear, so true. "I want to hire you," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "Not as a janitor. I want you to help her. I'll pay you anything you want." A shadow passed over his face. The clinician vanished, replaced by the ghost. "No," he said, the word absolute. "I don't do that anymore. I can't." "Why not?" she pressed, taking a step forward. "You're the only one who's gotten through. You're brilliant." He finally met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw the raw, bottomless ocean of his pain. "Because my own son had a lisp, Ms. Vance, and my daughter was afraid of the dark. Simple childish problems I thought I had a lifetime to help them with." His voice broke, just for a second. "I couldn't save my own children. What right do I have to save yours?" The air crackled with the force of his grief. Adeline stood before him, the powerful CEO, stripped of all her authority, left with only a desperate, singular plea. "I don't care about your rights," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she refused to name. "I care about my daughter." She made a sound. "Because of you. Please." He stared at her, a war raging in his eyes. The ghost who wanted only to be left alone versus the healer who couldn't ignore a child in pain. Her plea hung in the silent, empty room, a fragile lifeline thrown across an impossible chasm. Adeline's desperate plea hung in the barren room, a fragile thing in a space scrubbed clean of hope. Rhys's gaze drifted from her face to a spot on the wall behind her, a place where the paint was slightly less faded, where a collection of family photos must have once hung. He saw them in his mind's eye. Alessa laughing, Liam with a gap-toothed grin, Chloe covered in spaghetti sauce. The ghosts of the life he couldn't save. His first instinct, the one that had governed his life for 4 years, was to say no, to retreat back into the quiet, gray world he had built for himself, where the only person he could fail was himself. But then he saw Lara, not the CEO's daughter, but the little girl with sorrow in her eyes, trapped in a silence as suffocating as smoke. He had rattled the lock, and he had heard the faintest sound from within. To walk away now felt less like self-preservation and more like a different kind of abandonment. He let out a long, slow breath, the air leaving his lungs like a final surrender. "All right," he said, his voice rough. "But not as her therapist. And not for your money." Adeline blinked, taken aback. "What do you mean?" "I have conditions," he stated, his tone shifting. the ghost momentarily receding to make way for the professional. First, this is entirely off the books. No one can know who I was or what I'm doing. To the world, I'm an aid, a companion, nothing more. Second, my methods are my own. You don't question them, and you certainly don't interfere, especially not in front of her. Third, I don't want your salary. Pay me what the temp agency was paying me. A janitor's wage, nothing more. This isn't a career move for me, Miss Vance. It's something else. Adeline wanted to argue, to insist on giving him a fortune, but she saw the unyielding resolve in his eyes. This wasn't a negotiation. It was the price of his help. Okay, she agreed, nodding. Whatever you need. 2 days later, Rhys Bowen walked back onto the 50th floor of the Vance Corporation. This time, he didn't wear a gray polo. He wore simple dark slacks and a plain blue button-down shirt. His new ID badge read, Rhys Bowen, Child Enrichment Aide. It was a meaningless title for an impossible job. Adeline met him in the lounge, the scene of his firing. Her demeanor was different now, less imperious, more uncertain. A woman named Clara, Ilara's nanny, stood beside her, her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of suspicion and disapproval. Clara will get you acquainted with Ilara's schedule, Adeline said, avoiding Rhys's eyes. She has art therapy at 3, occupational therapy at 4:30, and— Cancel it, Rhys said quietly. Both women stared at him. Excuse me? Clara asked, her voice sharp. Cancel all of it. For the rest of the week, Rhys clarified, his gaze fixed on Adeline. Her schedule is full of adults trying to force a result. What she needs is space. She needs silence that isn't demanding. Adeline hesitated for a beat, then gave a curt nod to the stunned nanny. You heard him. Clear her schedule. It was the first test of her promise not to interfere, and she had passed. He found Ilara in her playroom. It was a child's paradise designed by an adult who had read all the right books. A miniature art gallery, a library of award-winning literature, a collection of sustainable, educational toys. It was beautiful, expensive, and as sterile as a laboratory. Ilara was in a corner, sketching in a notepad. When she saw him enter, she flinched, her whole body tensing. She remembered him. He was the man who had been cruel, the man who had been fired because of her. She hunched over her drawing, trying to make herself disappear. Rhys didn't force it. He didn't walk over and offer a friendly smile or a cheerful hello. He did the opposite. He gave her the one thing no other adult had, the gift of being ignored. He surveyed the room, his eyes passing over the expensive, complicated toys, and found what he was looking for, a simple, forgotten wooden box of plain building blocks. He picked it up, walked to the center of the room, a deliberate, neutral space 10 feet away from her, and sat on the floor. He opened the box and began to build. He didn't try to make anything fancy. He just stacked one block on top of another. His movements were slow, methodical. He started to hum, a low, nameless tune. He was creating a small bubble of calm, non-demanding presence. He wasn't another therapist trying to fix her. He was just a quiet man in a quiet room. For a full hour, that was all they did. He built, she drew, and the silence between them slowly changed from something tense and fearful to something soft and shared. Ilara began to steal glances at him from over the top of her notepad, her curiosity warring with her caution. She watched him build a simple, precarious tower. He reached for the final block, placing it carefully on the top. The tower stood for a second, then wobbled, and came crashing down with a series of soft, wooden clatters. Rhys didn't sigh in frustration. He didn't react at all. He just looked at the scattered blocks for a moment, then calmly began to gather them, preparing to build again. One of the blocks had rolled across the thick rug, stopping just inches from Ilara's foot. She looked at the block. She looked at the man, his back now to her as he gathered the other pieces. Then, with a movement so small it was almost imperceptible, she pushed the stray block with the toe of her shoe, sending it sliding a few feet back toward the middle of the room. She immediately looked down at her notepad, her cheeks flushing, as if she hadn't done it at all. Reese saw the movement out of the corner of his eye. He didn't turn. He didn't say, "Thank you." But for the first time in a very long time, a genuine smile touched his lips. The first block of a fragile bridge had just been laid. For a week, the playroom was a land of quiet routine. Every afternoon, Reese would arrive, give a polite nod to the nanny, Clara, and enter Elara's world. He never spoke to the girl. He would simply find his spot on the floor and engage in some quiet, solitary activity. One day he built with blocks. The next, he would read a thick paperback novel, its cover worn from use. Another, he would sketch in a small notebook, his pencil making soft, rhythmic scratching sounds. He was a mountain, a quiet, unmovable, and utterly predictable presence in her life. He asked for nothing. He expected nothing. From her office, Adeline watched excerpts of the nanny cam footage, her frustration mounting. She was paying for a world-renowned expert, and what she was getting was nothing. Just a man sitting in a room with her daughter. There was no therapy, no engagement, no progress. It felt like a colossal waste of time, a new and expensive form of failure. Her fingers itched to pick up the phone, to demand a strategy, a timeline, a measurable outcome. But she had made a promise. And the memory of that impossible, miraculous hum in the car was the only thing that kept her from breaking it. On the 8th day, Reese changed the routine. He arrived not with a book or a notepad, but with a huge, heavy roll of brown craft paper and a box of thick charcoal sticks. He said nothing to Elara, who was in her usual corner, but unrolled the paper across the vast expanse of the playroom floor, creating a massive, blank canvas. He kicked off his shoes, knelt on the paper, and began to draw. He didn't draw houses or animals or people. He drew huge, sweeping arcs of black, his whole body moving with the motion. He drew angry, jagged zigzags, soft, round circles, and long, straight lines that raced from one end of the paper to the other. He was making a mess. He was creating chaos. It was a silent, emotional explosion in the center of the pristine room. It was the visual equivalent of a scream. Elara stopped sketching and watched him, her eyes wide. This was new. This wasn't the quiet, placid man from last week. This was something wilder, more expressive. After a few minutes of this frantic, silent storytelling, Reese paused. He picked up one of the charcoal sticks and, as if by accident, rolled it across the floor. It came to a stop just a few inches from her knee. He didn't ask for it back. He simply picked up another stick and continued his work on the far side of the paper. Elara stared at the black stick. It was an invitation. It was a challenge. For a full minute, she remained frozen. Then, with a hesitant, trembling hand, she reached out and picked it up. She looked at the blank space of paper in her corner. She made a single, small mark. A tiny, timid circle. Reese saw it. He didn't stop. He didn't praise her. He simply altered his own drawing. A long, flowing line that had been heading for the edge of the paper suddenly curved, swooping across the empty space and connecting with her tiny circle. He looped around it once, twice, enclosing her small mark in a gentle, protective embrace before shooting off in a new direction. He had heard her. He had answered. A silent conversation began. She would draw a small shape, and he would respond, connecting his lines to hers, dancing around her marks, weaving them into a larger, shared tapestry of black and brown. They were speaking without making a sound. The next afternoon, Reese accompanied Elara to her school in his new role as her official aide. During recess, he kept his distance, observing from a bench near the manicured hedges. Elara sat on a buddy bench at the edge of the playground, a place that was supposed to signal to other kids that she wanted a friend. It had become her island of isolation. Soon, 3 boys approached her. Reese recognized the leader, Griffin, from the school's parent directory. His father was a notoriously aggressive executive on Adeline's senior team. They didn't push her. They didn't grab her things. Their cruelty was more refined. They formed a semicircle in front of her, blocking her view of the other playing children. "Hey, Alara," Griffin said, a smug grin on his face. "Cat got your tongue?" One of his friends snickered. "Maybe she doesn't know how to talk. My dad says her mom is too busy working to teach her words." "Is that it, Alara?" Griffin leaned in closer. "Are you a broken toy? You just sit there. Don't you ever do anything?" Ilara's only response was to shrink in on herself, her hands clutching a small silver locket at her neck. She stared down at her shoes, her small body a statue of misery, weathering a storm of words she couldn't answer. Reese watched, his jaw tight, but he didn't move. He wasn't just watching the boys. He was watching the two teachers on duty who were deep in a conversation 50 feet away, oblivious. He was watching the other children, who gave the bench a wide berth. He wasn't just seeing an act of bullying. He was assessing an entire ecosystem of neglect. The bell shrieked, signaling the end of recess. Griffin and his friends ran off, laughing. Reese waited until the playground was nearly empty before he walked over to the bench where Alara still sat, frozen. He sat on the other end, leaving a respectful space between them. He didn't mention what he had just seen. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. Instead, he pulled out his small sketchbook and a pencil. In a few quick, sure strokes, he drew a picture of a magnificent lion with a huge, flowing mane. But he drew the lion's face with wide, terrified eyes and a single tear rolling down its furry cheek. He tore the page from the sketchbook and slid it down the bench to her. Ilara looked down at the drawing of the sad, scared lion. Her lower lip trembled. She looked up from the paper and met his eyes, and for the first time, he saw something flicker there, a spark of profound, grateful understanding. He saw her. He truly saw her. The drawing of the sad lion marked a subtle shift. Ilara's engagement in their silent conversations on the giant roll of paper grew bolder. Her timid circles became confident swirls. Her hesitant lines became decisive slashes. She was finding a voice on the page, a way to express the storm of feelings her own voice could not. But in the world outside the playroom, the storm was real. The bullying incident on the playground, as Reese knew it would, reached Adeline's desk in the form of a sanitized, jargon-filled report from the school's headmaster. It spoke of social integration challenges and non-physical peer conflict. Adeline read the report and saw red. She summoned Reese to her office that evening. It was the first time they had spoken in over a week. "I've read the report," she said, her voice clipped. All business. She was back in her CEO armor. "This is unacceptable." "I want the names of the boys involved. I'll speak to their parents personally. Griffin's father, Paul, is one of my VPS. I'll have him in my office tomorrow morning. We'll have them expelled if we have to. This ends now." She looked at him, expecting agreement, a plan of attack. Reese remained calm, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. "No," he said quietly. Adeline stared at him. "No." "What do you mean, no? We have to protect her. Getting those boys expelled won't protect her," he countered, his voice even but firm. "It will paint a giant target on her back. It will make her the pariah who got the popular kids kicked out. You'll be punishing the symptoms, Miss Vance, not the disease. And the disease is a culture that starts with the parents. Then what do you suggest we do?" "Nothing," she shot back, exasperated. "I have a suggestion," he said, "but it's unconventional, and it requires you to trust me." Completely. She looked at him, at the quiet confidence in his eyes, and thought of her daughter's charcoal drawings, now filled with a life and energy she hadn't seen in a year. She thought of her promise. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice surrendering the fight. A few days later, a mandatory emergency leadership seminar was called for Adeline's senior executive team. The topic was deliberately vague. Improving interdepartmental synergy and empathetic communication. The executives, including a puffed-up and arrogant Paul, Griffin's father, filed into a conference room, grumbling about the waste of a perfectly good afternoon. Adeline made a brief introduction, then ceded the floor to the consultant leading the seminar. Rhys Bowen walked to the front of the room in his simple blue shirt and slacks. He looked utterly out of place, a rowboat in a sea of yachts. Paul scoffed audibly. "This is the guy who's going to teach us about synergy?" Rhys ignored him. "Good afternoon," he began. "We're going to start with an exercise. Please get into your assigned teams." He directed them to 3 tables, each with a complex diagram and a large box of building blocks. "The goal," he explained, "is to build the structure in this diagram. The rules are simple. Only one person on each team is allowed to touch the blocks, and that person is not allowed to speak for the duration of the exercise." The room erupted in groans. It was a ridiculous, childish game. Rhys designated the silent builder for each team. The exercise began. The result was immediate chaos. The executives, natural-born leaders and commanders, barked orders. "No, not that one. The long blue piece. Angle it, angle it." The silent builders, overwhelmed by the barrage of conflicting instructions, grew flustered, their movements clumsy. Towers collapsed, tempers flared. Every team failed, spectacularly. "Why did you fail?" Rhys asked the room in the ensuing silence. "Our builder was incompetent," Paul snapped, glaring at the junior executive he'd been paired with. "He didn't listen." Rhys's gaze was piercing. "Or perhaps the failure was in your inability to communicate with the empathy and patience," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of an anvil. "You had a team member with a limitation, and instead of adapting your strategy, you shouted louder, assuming the fault was theirs. You treated them like a broken tool." A thick, uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Paul's face flushed a deep red. The subtext was a dagger, and it had hit its mark. For his next exercise, Rhys passed out small slips of paper. "I want you to write down one thing you've sacrificed in your personal life for your career this month. No names." He collected the anonymous confessions and read them aloud. "I missed my son's championship soccer game to take a call with the Singapore office. My daughter asked me to read her a bedtime story, and I told her I had to finish a report. I haven't had a real conversation with my wife in weeks." The air in the room changed. The arrogant, competitive posture of every executive softened, replaced by a shared, quiet shame. They were all the same. Rhys let the silence sit for a moment before speaking. "The structures you build in this company will be forgotten," he said, his gaze sweeping across their faces, finally landing on Adeline, who was watching from the back. "The stock price will fluctuate. The only thing you will ever build that lasts is the character of your children. What are you teaching them to build?" That evening, Elias was on her usual bench when Griffin approached her. He was alone. He scuffed his expensive sneakers on the pavement, his hands jammed in his pockets. He wouldn't look at her. "Hey," he mumbled. I'm sorry. He pulled something from his pocket. It was Alara's silver locket, the one she hadn't even realized was missing until now. He must have snatched it during the taunting. He held it out to her. "Here." Elias stared at him, then at the locket, her mind struggling to process the scene. She tentatively took it from his hand. "Okay, well, bye," Griffin said quickly, and practically fled. Elias looked down at the locket, warm in her palm, its familiar weight a comfort. She looked at the retreating figure of the boy who had caused her so much pain. The world, for so long a place of predictable cruelty, had just done something completely, impossibly, new. It had apologized. Adeline watched the security footage for the 10th time. It was grainy, shot from a high angle, and had no audio. But it was the most compelling thing she had seen all year. There, on the screen, was her daughter, Elias, sitting on the bench. There was Griffin, the boy who had tormented her, approaching alone. She saw his awkward posture, the way he scuffed his feet, the quick, almost furtive way he handed over the silver locket. She saw her daughter's stunned stillness as she took it, and she saw the boy practically flee, as if from the scene of a crime. It was a miracle, a quiet, world-altering miracle. Reese had done it. He hadn't used threats or corporate power or expulsion. He had somehow reached into the heart of a cruel little boy and planted a seed of empathy. He hadn't just stopped the bullying, he had reversed it. The realization settled on Adeline with a profound and uncomfortable weight. Reese had diagnosed and treated the sickness in Griffin's family in a single afternoon. He had looked at the symptom, a cruel child, and correctly identified the disease. The parents. The thought turned a cold, sharp mirror back on herself. For months, she had focused on Alara's silence as a problem to be solved, a malfunction to be fixed. She had never truly asked what disease her own daughter's silence was a symptom of. She was afraid of the answer. The next afternoon, she sought Reese out. She found him in the playroom with Alara. The giant sheet of paper on the floor was now almost entirely black with their shared drawings. Alara was sitting at a small keyboard, hesitantly tapping out a melody, while Reese sat nearby, humming quietly along. It was a scene of such peaceful, harmonious connection that it made Adeline's heart ache. She waited until he was leaving for the day and stopped him in the lounge. "I saw the footage," she said, her voice quiet. "With Griffin. What you did, it was brilliant. I've never seen anything like it. I just showed them a mirror," he said simply. "You did more than that," she insisted. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to ask the question that had been haunting her. "You said the boy's behavior was a symptom of the parents' culture. So, you tell me, Reese. What is Alara's silence a symptom of? What disease is she reflecting?" Reese met her gaze, his expression gentle, but his eyes were clear, unflinching. He knew this moment had been coming. He knew it was time. "Alara's voice is there," he said, his voice calm and steady. "But she's locked it away because she's trying to protect you. She thinks if she speaks, she'll have to talk about her father, and she knows you can't handle it." The words were a direct hit. Adeline's defenses flew up instantly, her CEO armor snapping into place. "That's ridiculous," she said, her tone sharp, dismissive. "I'm fine. That's all in the past. I've moved on." Reese didn't back down. He took a small step closer, his voice dropping slightly, forcing her to listen. "Is it? Your husband left you for another woman, Adeline. Alara knows this. She saw it, and you have acted like it was just a failed merger. She needs to see you grieve. She needs to know it's okay to hurt. She has to know you didn't break." Every word was a hammer blow, shattering the carefully constructed dam of denial she had built over the past year. "He left you for another woman." The clinical, unvarnished truth of it, spoken aloud in the quiet of the lounge, was a cruelty far greater than asking a mute girl to sing. It was the truth she had run from every single day. The humiliation, the betrayal, the searing pain of being replaced. Her breath hitched. A tremor started in her hands. The pristine, orderly world she had built, the endless meetings and reports and acquisitions, all of it dissolved into a meaningless blur. The only thing that was real was the gaping, bleeding wound in the center of her life, a wound she had pretended wasn't there. "No," she whispered, but the word had no conviction. It was the last gasp of a dying lie. A sob, raw and ugly, tore its way up from a place deep inside her. It was a sound of pure agony. Her perfect posture collapsed, and she stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth as if to hold the sound in. The tears she had refused to shed for a year came in a hot, blinding flood. She sank into one of the expensive leather chairs, her body racked with shuddering, uncontrollable sobs. She wept for her broken marriage. She wept for her own cowardice. But most of all, she wept for her little girl, who had been bravely and silently carrying the weight of all this pain for the both of them. Reese didn't move. He didn't offer a comforting hand or a soft platitude. He simply stood there, a quiet, steady presence in the storm. He bore witness to her pain, giving her the space and the unspoken permission to finally, completely, fall apart. Minutes passed. The violent storm of her grief slowly subsided, leaving in its wake an exhausted, hollowed-out calm. She sat slumped in the chair, her tailored suit wrinkled, her face a mess of ruined makeup and raw emotion. She was no longer a CEO. She was just a heartbroken woman. She looked up at Reese, her eyes red and swollen. All the anger, all the denial, all the pride was gone. There was only a raw, terrifying vulnerability. "What do I do now?" she asked, her voice a hoarse whisper. Reese's expression was full of a deep, sad empathy. "Now," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "you learn how to speak the same language your daughter does. The language of truth." The aftermath of Adeline's breakdown left the lounge feeling like a battlefield after the fighting has stopped. It was quiet, desolate, and everything had changed. She was raw, exposed, and for the first time in her adult life, she had no idea what to do next. She looked at Reese, her expression a plea. "What do I do now?" Reese's response was her new mission directive. "Now," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "you learn how to speak the same language your daughter does. The language of truth." Over the next hour, he gave her a strategy. It wasn't a corporate plan with action items and key performance indicators. It was a roadmap to a place she had been avoiding for a year, her own heart. "You have to get out of here," he'd said, gesturing to the opulent lounge, the city glittering beyond the windows. "This building, this life, it's your armor. You can't be real with her while you're wearing it. Take her somewhere that was real, somewhere the three of you were a family, the lake cabin," she'd whispered, the words tasting like ash. They hadn't been there since Damien left. "Go there," Reese had urged, "and don't go with the goal of making her speak. That's a performance metric. Go with the goal of letting her see you. Your sadness, your anger, your truth. You have to show her your scars before she'll feel safe enough to show you hers." The next morning, Adeline Vance did something she hadn't done in a decade. She cleared her calendar. An entire week. A multi-million-dollar acquisition deal on the verge of closing. A quarterly review with the board. All of it was delegated or postponed. Her executive assistant was speechless. For the first time, Adeline was putting her daughter on the schedule and canceling everything else. Packing was a form of archaeology, digging through a past she had tried to bury. She pushed aside her tailored blazers and silk blouses and pulled out old, soft sweaters and worn-in jeans. At the back of her closet, she found a dusty photo album. She opened it to a picture of the three of them on the dock at the cabin. Damien was holding up a tiny fish, laughing. Ilara, age 7, was looking at him with pure, unadulterated adoration. Adeline was looking at them both, her smile radiant, effortless. It felt like a picture of a different woman from a different lifetime. She packed the album. She told Ilara they were going on a trip, just the two of them. The girl's expression was unreadable, a quiet, cautious curiosity. The journey north was a journey back in time. The relentless steel and glass of the city melted away, replaced by rolling hills and fiery autumn foliage. The air itself seemed to change, losing its sharp competitive edge. They drove in a comfortable silence, a stark contrast to the tense, humming quiet of their drives home from school. The cabin was just as they had left it, a rustic A-frame nestled in a grove of pine trees overlooking the still gray water of the lake. It smelled of cedar and wood smoke and memories. Adeline opened the door, and the ghosts of their past life rushed out to greet them. Damien's fishing rod was still propped in the corner. Ilara's colorful drawings were still taped to the refrigerator. The first day was awkward. Adeline, stripped of her phone and her work, felt a phantom limb. She tried to fill the long hours, suggesting a walk, then a board game, then a movie. Ilara was compliant but distant, retreating into the familiar safety of her sketchbook. Adeline could feel herself failing, the old panic of not knowing how to fix this rising in her throat. She took a deep breath and remembered Reese's words. Just be present. That evening, a cool autumn chill had settled over the lake. Adeline built a fire in the stone fireplace, the crackle and pop of the logs the only sound in the room. Elias was curled up on the big, worn sofa sketching. Adeline sat on the floor, leaning against the sofa, and pulled the old photo album into her lap. She opened it, her fingers tracing the glossy images. She didn't speak for a long time. Finally, she stopped on the picture from the dock. "I remember this day," she said, her voice a little thick. "You spent the whole afternoon trying to learn how to skip a stone." "You were so determined." She managed a small, watery smile. "Your father was so proud when you finally got one to bounce 3 times. She let the silence sit, let the name hang in the air between them. It was the first time she had mentioned him by name, without flinching, in over a year. Elias had stopped sketching. She was watching her mother, her expression intense. Adeline took a shaky breath, the firelight casting flickering shadows on her face. For the first time, she let the mask of the strong, capable CEO fall away completely, revealing the heartbroken woman beneath. "I miss this," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I miss us." She finally looked up from the album and met her daughter's gaze. Her eyes were swimming with the tears she had held back for so long. "I know I haven't talked about it, sweetie." "About?" "When Daddy left." Her voice dropped to a raw, painful whisper. I was so scared." She had opened the door. She had laid down her armor and exposed her wounded heart. Elias stared at her mother, at this new, fragile, and achingly real version of her. She put her sketchbook down, and then, in the quiet of the cabin, surrounded by the ghosts of their past, she reached out and laid her small hand on her mother's, a silent acknowledgement of their shared pain. Adeline held her breath and waited, not for a solution or a diagnosis or a cure. For the first time in a year, she simply waited for her daughter. The warmth of Elias's small hand on her own was a grounding force, an anchor in a sea of resurfacing pain. Adeline held it, her thumb stroking the back of her daughter's knuckles. The fire crackled, filling the quiet cabin with a soft, comforting sound. For a long time, neither of them moved. It was enough, Adeline thought. Just this connection. It was more than they'd had in a year. Then, Elias gently pulled her hand away. She slid off the sofa and went to the small backpack she'd brought, the one containing her school supplies. Adeline's heart sank for a second, fearing the moment was over, that she had retreated back into her shell. But Elias returned with her sketchbook and a single stick of black charcoal. She sat on the floor in front of Adeline, tucked her legs beneath her, and opened the book to a fresh page. Her expression was solemn, determined. She was not retreating. She was preparing to speak. The first drawing was simple. 3 stick figures, holding hands under a smiling sun. A mother, a father, and a little girl with a triangle dress. It was their family. Before. Adeline nodded, her throat tight. "I remember," she whispered. Elias turned the page. The next drawing was stark. The father figure was on one side of the page, walking away. On the other side stood the mother and the little girl. And the father was holding hands with a new stick figure, one with long scribbled hair. The betrayal, rendered in the devastatingly simple lines of a child's drawing. The next page was even more brutal. The mother figure had her back to the little girl. She was walking toward a tall, imposing rectangle covered in little square windows, the Vance Corporation building. The little girl was left utterly alone in the vast white space of the page. Adeline felt the air leave her lungs. It was an accusation, and it was the truth. Damien had left them for another woman, and she, in her pain and pride, had left her daughter for her work. Elias turned to the final page. It was just the little girl, standing alone. But this time she had a large black X drawn crudely over her mouth. It was the story of the last year. A story of a little girl who had lost not one, but both her parents, and then her voice. Tears streamed silently down Adeline's face as she looked at the final, damning image. There were no more excuses, no more justifications. There was only the truth, drawn in charcoal. "Oh, baby," she sobbed, her voice a broken whisper. "I'm so sorry." "I see now. I see. You thought I left you too." She reached out, her hand trembling. "I was so busy trying to be strong, I didn't see that you needed me to be sad with you." This was it. The complete surrender. The total admission of her failure. Ilara looked up from her sketchbook, her own eyes shimmering with tears that mirrored her mother's. She looked at the drawing of her father leaving, and then at her mother's heartbroken face. The fortress of silence inside her, already weakened by Reese's patient siege and now washed by the flood of her mother's honest grief, finally crumbled. She opened her mouth. Her voice, fragile and raspy from a year of disuse, was barely more than a breath, but it was the clearest, most powerful sound Adeline had ever heard. "He shouldn't have hurt you, Mommy." The words, so full of empathy, of love, of a child's fierce desire to protect her parent, shattered the last of Adeline's composure. She let out a choked cry and pulled her daughter into her arms, burying her face in Ilara's hair. Ilara hugged her back, her small arms wrapping tightly around her mother's neck. They held each other and wept, their shared tears washing away a year's worth of unspoken pain, loneliness, and fear. They talked for hours after that, curled up on the sofa with a thick blanket wrapped around them. It started with Ilara's hesitant, whispered words, and Adeline's gentle, patient questions. They talked about the day her father left. They talked about the other woman. They talked about the kids at school. And for every painful memory Ilara shared, Adeline shared one of her own, meeting her daughter's truth with her own. It was a clumsy, heartbreaking, and beautiful conversation. It was the beginning of everything. The next morning, Adeline woke to the smell of pine and the sight of the sun rising over the lake, painting the water in hues of pink and gold. The air in the cabin felt different. It was light. It was clean. She found Ilara already awake, sitting on the end of the wooden dock, wrapped in a blanket. Adeline poured 2 mugs of hot chocolate and went to join her. She sat down, handing a mug to her daughter, and they watched the sunrise in a comfortable, easy silence. After a few minutes, Ilara pointed across the water. "Look," she said, her voice soft in the morning air. "A loon." Adeline looked. She saw the bird diving for its breakfast. It was a simple, normal, childish observation, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. She felt a smile spread across her face, a real smile, one that reached deep inside and warmed the parts of her that had been cold for so long. She pulled out her phone. For the first time in a week, she looked at the screen, but she didn't check her email. She opened a new text message to a number she had memorized. Her thumbs moved, typing out 2 simple words. "Thank you." She hit send, then put the phone away, and wrapped her arm around her daughter, pulling her close. The healing had begun. 6 months later, the city was the same, but the world had been entirely remade. The autumn chill had given way to a bright spring, and inside the Vance Corporation, a quiet revolution had taken place. At precisely 5 o'clock, Adeline Vance would stand up from her desk, put on her coat, and walk out of her office, often leaving her phone behind. Her new mantra, much to the astonishment of her board of directors, was, "Unless the building is on fire, it can wait until morning." Her evenings were no longer filled with reports and projections, but with the sounds of a home that was finally alive. Laughter was the most common sound, a bright, bubbling music that Adeline had thought she would never hear again. It was Ilara's laughter, full and uninhibited. Her daughter, who had once been a ghost in their own home, was now a vibrant presence. She had friends from school over, she argued about what to watch on TV, and she sang constantly and joyfully in a voice that was clear and strong. The silence had not just been broken, it had been banished. Reese Bowen was no longer a ghost, either. He was a constant, steady presence in their lives, the quiet center around which their new family gracefully orbited. The shared trauma and the fight to heal Alara had forged a bond between him and Adeline that was deeper than anything she had ever known. It was a love built not on glamour or ambition, but on a foundation of shared scars and profound, mutual respect. Today was a landmark day. They stood together on a tree-lined street in a quiet neighborhood, the afternoon sun warm on their faces. In front of them was a beautifully renovated brownstone, its large windows gleaming. A simple, elegant sign hung above the door. The Bowen Center for Childhood Voice. It was the opening day of the non-profit music and speech therapy clinic that Adeline's foundation had funded, a tribute to the son Reese had lost and a beacon for other families lost in the wilderness of trauma. The opening was not a grand corporate affair. The guests were a small collection of therapists, local families, and a few of Adeline's trusted friends. Adeline stood before the small crowd, Reese and Alara on either side of her, and gave a short, heartfelt speech. "There is no greater tragedy than a child who is unheard," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Whether they are silenced by trauma, by fear, or by adults who are simply too busy to listen. The mission of this center is simple: to listen, to provide a safe space where every child can find their voice." She turned, a brilliant, genuine smile lighting up her face, and placed a hand on Reese's arm. "And there is no one better to lead that mission than the center's director, a man who taught me everything I know about listening, Reese Bowen." As applause filled the small garden, Reese stepped forward, a quiet humility in his posture. He was back in his element, his purpose restored. The deep, weary sadness in his eyes had been replaced by a soft, steady light. Later, after the speeches and the small reception, the three of them stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the center, the setting sun glinting off the new sign. Alara, holding Reese's hand, looked up at him. "Are you going to teach the new kids how to sing, Reese?" she asked, her voice full of innocent curiosity. Reese looked down at the little girl who had, in so many ways, saved him as much as he had saved her. He then looked at Adeline, at the incredible woman who had shattered her own world to rebuild it around her daughter, and his heart was filled with a sense of peace he thought he would never feel again. He squeezed Alara's hand, a deep, warm smile on his face. "No," he said softly, "I'm just going to teach them that they already know how. They just need to find someone who is truly willing to listen." The janitor who had been fired for an act of perceived cruelty, the CEO who had been blind to the truth in her own home, and the little girl who had found her voice in the quietest of places, all stood together under the warm spring sky. The past was a scar that had taught them how to heal, and the future was an open door, filled with the promise of a song yet to be sung. And so, our story finds its way out into the world. I always love to think of these tales finding a home after I send them off. If you feel like sharing, I'd be honored to know where this one landed with you tonight. A comment with your city or just a simple hello from your part of the world truly brightens my day. If you'd like to be a destination for future tales, the best way to ensure they find you is by leaving a like and subscribing. That notification bell is like putting your name on the map so the next story I send out knows exactly where to go. Until our paths cross in the next chapter, be well, and thank you for listening.